Afternoon and welcome to today's webcast. This webcast is held jointly by the Chartered Banker Institute, Manchester Metropolitan University, and ICAEW Northwest. In a moment, we will commence the webcast and meet today's host and guest speakers. Ahead of this, please note that we are recording this webcast and it will be available to watch on demand shortly afterwards. Please feel free to submit questions via the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and share these with the panelists, and they will answer them towards the later half of the webcast. We hope you enjoyed today's session, and thank you for joining us. Stuart, over to you.
Wonderful, thank you, Emma, and welcome everyone to this session. I'll be hosting and chairing today's session on behavioural biases in financial decision making. Why am I here? Well, most of my career has been in banking, leading teams, dealing with clients, but while working at a bank, and I did my first master's, part of that course was on psychology and behavioural biases, and frankly I found it really interesting and fascinating, so much so that I turned the discretionary dissertation into that. It sparked an interest and then a passion, and that was probably a big part of me moving from the banking world into the academic world, which I now find myself sitting. So that's the reason I'm here. I'll hand over to Kat to say who she is.
Hello everyone, my name is Kat Werner-Masters and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Accounting, Finance and Banking at Manchester Metropolitan University. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk about this topic because, just like Stuart, I really share a great passion for behavioral economics, behavioral science and finance in general, and how it can change the world into something better, but particularly in the context of decision making. So I'm looking forward to the next 45 minutes.
Wonderful, thank you, Kat. And we're also joined by Hannah. Over to you.
Thanks, Stuart. Hi, everyone. My name's Hannah Johnson. I am the founder and director of Excel Business Psychology. So as it says in the name, I'm a business psychologist. And what that means is that I work with lots of different organizations to help them improve their performance as a business through their people. So it's kind of a combination of the business stuff and psychology, applying psychology in a business context. And my work takes me into primarily SME organisations, working with managing directors and their teams in order to help them be more effective, to have better conversations, to think about how their brain impacts their decision making, how it impacts their conversations with members of their staff, how it influences essentially everything that they do. And I will coach, I will train, I will do all sorts of different things with them in order to get them thinking a little bit differently. So like Kat and Stuart, I'm very interested in how the brain influences what we do every single day, how it influences the way in which we behave, especially in the workplace. So again, interested and really happy to have been invited along today to talk on this topic.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Hannah. So what we'll do today is each of the panelists will share their perspective. I'll start off in a second. That will probably take the first 15 to 20 minutes or so. After that, we'll open it up for questions. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A box as you're going through. You'll see two boxes. There's a chat box and a Q&A box. If you can put it in the Q&A box, that will make my life easier because I'll know where to look. And then we should have plenty of times after the initial presentation to be able to delve into the questions and make it more of a discussion. So really looking forward to that. What I thought I'd do first is, as I'm leading off, what I want to do is to try and talk around the psychology of this, explain what's happening in a way that's accessible to everyone, and to start to define some of the things that we're looking at. So I guess the key thing to define here is this idea of what does bias really mean? Well, I want to go to the other extreme and think of a perfect world where a brain was a perfect supercomputer that could take into account all the key factors in any decision that you need to make, financially or otherwise. It could then weigh them in a balanced way, analyze them, evaluate them, and then come up with a decision. That's the sort of perfect model that we might work against. Now, the brain isn't a supercomputer in that way. It's an organic system that's developed over millions of years. And certainly if we're talking about financial decision making and money, there is no bit of the brain that deals with financial decision making, because over the millions of years that humans have evolved, that wasn't something that we had to do on the plains of Africa or in our caves way back in time. But what the brain does do is try and do the best it can, and it does an amazing job, but it makes mistakes. Now, there's no shock there that the brain makes mistakes. It wasn't designed to do the task. It would need to be a supercomputer of immeasurable proportion to, maybe if you want to spend some money, to consider all the available options that you could spend it on, enjoying yourself, investments. There's just a myriad of opportunities. It can't do it. So it makes mistakes, so no surprise. The idea of it being biased, though, is a bit more. It means that actually the mistakes are in a predictable direction. That might mean in some circumstances that we are more prone to take more risk in circumstances than is the norm, and disproportionately will take more risk. In others, it might be that our decision making is impact on what we were doing before. So the activity immediately preceding what we're doing influences our decision making and means that we're really, really inconsistent. But being biased and predictably biased also means that others can predict the way we behave. So fraudsters, financial firms that might want to sell you things, hopefully with good and putting the customer at the centre of what we're doing, but also with negligent intent, will know that we will behave in predictable ways. Salespeople and marketers have known that for years. More positively, the fact that we are predictable means that bodies such as government that are looking for altruistic reasons to nudge us in the behaviours that might be more healthy, more appropriate, lead to better financial and personal outcomes, can use this information in positive ways to influence, because we're biased and we're predictable in the way we do that. So that's what we mean by biased, but how do we get there? So I want to talk a little bit around the mechanism, and I want to talk about how we become experienced. Now, by experienced, what I mean is maybe an experienced financial professional. And many of us will remember when we first started going into new jobs that the people that have been doing that job for many years seemed like they could do it effortlessly. I remember seeing commercial lenders when I first moved into commercial lending, and they would naturally be able to scan over financial accounts. They would come to conclusions really quickly. They will be able to go and visit a customer and intuitively make judgments. So I mean that sort of expertise, but also expertise in our daily life at a really basic level. So how we learn to walk, how you learn, I don't know, to drive a car, how you learn to do absolutely everything in your life. So I just want to talk through that process, because that will give you an idea about how those biases creep in. So let's take driving a car. The first time you ever get into a car, and I'm not looking forward to teaching my teenage daughter to drive, you get in the driver's seat and there's so much to do. You've got to watch the road, you've got to feed the wheel, you've got to remember which pedal does what, you've got to change gear at the appropriate time when the engine makes a noise, you've got to start all that stuff around biting points, you get to mirror signal maneuver, there's a lot to do. And you learn to do it, and you do it by repetition, and you get to the point that actually you're pretty good, and hopefully you can pass a test. So you get your driving test and you're remembering to adjust the mirror, you're remembering to do mirror signal maneuver, you're feeding the wheel, and you pass. It's amazing, and you go out on the road. And at first, you're still thinking about it. You're having to consciously think about it all the time. You're feeding the wheel, have adjusted the mirror, now indicate, and it is all takes you an awful lot of mental space. And at that point, you couldn't do multiple tasks at once. So if a friend or a member of your family wants to talk to you while you're driving, they need to be quiet because you need to concentrate. And at some stage, this conscious activity slips into our unconscious. And it doesn't happen on a particular day, but one day you realize that you've driven to work and you don't remember the journey. You're doing it naturally. You're turning, you're indicating, you're not really, and you can have a conversation, hopefully safely, on a hands-free mobile phone, or you can listen to the radio, you can have a conversation, and the driving is something that is happening in the background. Now, why is this important? Because that process of expertise means that it's now been passed to our unconscious. We're not thinking about it. If there's mistakes in the way that that's being coded, then those mistakes will continue as bad habits or biases, as we term them. Now, one of the things that the brain does is do this all the time. So, for example, on the call, if we had more time, we'd want to do a poll and ask you which sock you put on first in the morning. Now, many of us don't know the answer to that. We've done it automatically. It's in our subconscious sort of space. Now, why is this important? Because one of the things that the brain does is by handing over decisions and activities to the subconscious means that this is where bias is triggered. So I want to give you a very quick example before I hand over to Kat. One of the things that I used to do in the sales process when I was selling financial products is we had the idea of skiing downhill. And this was using a process that I now know is anchoring. So what we would do is we would talk about the most expensive option. Let's say it's £1,000 per month. And then we'd have some negotiation, and then eventually we'd settle with the client on something that was less fancy, but cost £800 a month. Now, because we started off at 1,800 didn't look as expensive, and we were trained not to do it the other way around, not to start with a cheap option at £400 a month and work up, because all of a sudden 800 starts to look expensive. Now, salespeople on the call will know that intuitively, but it applies much wider. So I'll give you an idea. If you ever want to negotiate a raise with your boss, the time to do it is after they maybe come on a webinar by ICAW or Chartered Banker talking about big numbers. Because all of a sudden, if they've been talking for 20 minutes about sums in thousands and millions of pounds, then your rise of a few £100 or a few percent suddenly doesn't start seeming that onerous. The worst time to apply for a pay rise is when your boss has been talking about the fact that first class stamps have gone up by a few pence. All of a sudden, relatively, because that sort of quantum has been embedded in their brain, then suddenly you asking for a rise that maybe hundreds or £1,000 suddenly starts to look really expensive. At a rational level, it shouldn't make a difference, but it's influenced by the fact that all this is handed over to our subconscious. Okay, hopefully that's got you thinking and understanding some of the mechanisms. I'm going to hand over to Kat to develop this idea and to give you some more examples. Over to you, Kat.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I really love your example, particularly given that I am actually taking driving lessons now. And in order to kind of reduce this overload of information and the cognitive load necessary to drive, I decided to go for an automatic car. And this is indeed a very practical example of how we are trying to cut down and to manage decision making in the context of biases. So just very briefly, Stuart already really nicely defined what biases are, but I just wanted to mention that we know that there are many different biases, and over the past few decades, there's been so much discussion regarding the impact on our decision making and the broader impact in terms of whole economies or even populations. So I think it's really useful to realize that we do use the shortcuts for many types of decisions. And you might have heard already, coming from very famous psychologists, Kahneman and Tversky, the two different ways of thinking, the two systems. One is the automatic that Stuart already mentioned, and the other one is the deliberate, more conscious one. Because we are human beings who are constrained by many different factors, whether it's our limited memory, whether it's the limited recall of past events, limited ability to forecast, to calculate, limited ability to concentrate, and finally, the impact of emotions of our own state, and finally, some personality traits, because not everything that we can do regarding the decision-making can be so fully rational, means that we are very much exposed to these shortcuts, which are heuristics, and if the use of these heuristics leads to decisions that are different to the ones that would be optimal for us, that is exactly when we're talking about biases. So one really fascinating idea that Stuart mentioned is regarding the idea of experience and whether the experience actually helps to reduce the impact of biases or whether it increases this impact. And that's a very good question. Why? Because there is no clear-cut answer to this question. On one side, as Stuart mentioned here, we're observing here learning effects. Learning effects imply that when initially something may be a very deliberate decision to us, which makes us pay more attention to making this decision and involve more resources, such as time and cognitive abilities, over time, we may be reducing these resources, which are scarce. And we do need to admit it, that as human beings, we don't want to put so many resources into every decision that we are making. This particular decision choice may actually become automatic, which means that while at the beginning we are likely to be closer to rationality, we later, with experience, may deviate from that. Interestingly, professional qualifications are not really mitigating this particular instance. In fact, it has been proven by quite a few studies that have been conducted in the field of behavioral economics and behavioral psychology, that particularly investors, those who know and are aware of the experience that they have, tends to actually behave in a manner that is more consistent with biases such as overconfidence, home bias, familiarity bias, because they think they have already acquired the necessary knowledge and skills that make them the expert in decision-making in the particular context that they are dealing with, such as investment, for instance. So this is a really excellent idea to point to another mitigating factor, which might be financial education. Many of us are probably asking ourselves, oh, if I study finance more, and if I watch more of this sort of debates, videos and discussion, will that make me more aware of my biases? Well, the answer is probably it will make you more aware, but you need to be very conscious of these biases when actually making decisions. In fact, a number of leading behavioral researchers in a London School of Economics have conducted a study for Financial Services Authority and have found that because biases are very much related to our personality rather than to the information that we are receiving, we are more prone to be biased even if we receive appropriate financial education. So if we are trying to counteract the biased decision-making, the best thing that we can do is probably to talk about it, to make people aware of it, but we should anticipate that any educational initiatives and providing additional information will actually have only modest effects and will mitigate this suboptimal decision-making only to some extent. So I hope that was a good introduction to the impact that biases have, and also to what we can do as professionals and educators in terms of mitigating them. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks, Kat. And I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who uses information in her day-to-day practice advising businesses. Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so it's interesting to listen to some of the things that Stuart and Kat have spoken about there, and then really think about how these biases and shortcuts, as Kat has explained, affect us in our day-to-day work. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of what my work entails is working with business owners and their management teams, and really helping them to understand their decision making and how that influences the performance of the business. And from my perspective, I think that essentially every decision made within a business is a financial decision, because it's always going to have an effect on the performance of the business. And that's what businesses are in really basic form. They are money-making machines. And so there's always going to be a financial impact of every decision that's made. And one of the things that I thought would be an interesting example to share around how these biases can come in is something really simple. And I talk about delegation a lot with my coachees and with the people that I do training workshops with. because delegation is a really interesting concept around how do we decide who to delegate a task to? How do we decide to give up that responsibility if it's something that we really like to do? And there's so much bias and so much brain power that goes into this, and we think of it as a really simple thing. But if you imagined, you're managing a team and you're trying to decide who should I give this task to, one of the things that might influence you is something that we call the availability bias. So this is where the information that comes to our mind more easily is something that has maybe an emotional attachment to, or simply just stands out more in our minds. A really good example, a simple non-business example of that would be people who are scared of flying. Usually that comes from that fear of something terrible happening when you get onto the plane, which actually statistically is very, very small. But we see, newspaper articles about it every time, something tragic happens. It's there, it's published, it's talked about, and it makes it seem very common when actually it isn't at all. And so what then happens, this availability bias kicks in, and it means that people then are fearful that that same thing will happen to them because it's emotionally charged and the availability of that memory is very strong. And the same thing can happen. I mean, that's a quite commonly used example of availability bias, but something, if we think about that within business, if we're talking about delegation, it could be as simple as, if I'm going to delegate a task to someone and the last time they did something for me, whether it was related or entirely unrelated, the last time they did it, they did a really poor job and I had to deal with the consequences of that. And maybe my boss was really frustrated with me. So that memory sticks out really strong in my mind. That's going to influence whether I delegate a task to this person in future, whether I give them the opportunity to develop themselves through this particular task. So there's lots of different decision making that could come into this. We could think about, well, do I give it to the more senior person because they're going to do it faster? Or is that just a perception that they have more skill and they're going to do it faster? I might decide to give it to the more junior person because I'm going to give them the opportunity to develop. Or I might give it to the junior person because actually their salary is lower and therefore their time doesn't cost as much money to the business. So we can start to think about something as simple as just giving someone a task to do has a financial impact, but it is influenced by that individual's own biases as to what they think is going to be a successful decision. And if they make that decision on their own and they make that decision quickly, then they lose the ability to manage the impact of those biases. So as Kat was talking about there, when we're engaged in this system one thinking, which we are a lot of the time, it's just so fast, really, really quick. And we don't even really realize how our brain has influenced that decision. So if we can slow things down, it makes it less likely that those biases will negatively impact our decision or have an impact that maybe would have led to an outcome that isn't ideal. So we want to be able to slow our thinking down a little bit. And there's lots of different examples of this. You could think about promoting people within a business. I see this a lot. Usually the person who's performing the best is promoted into a management position. And just because someone's good at the job that they are doing right now, that might be quite a technical role, doesn't mean they're going to be good at managing a group of people who do that technical role. It's an entirely different skill set to manage versus the doing the task itself. But again, biases come into those decisions. Familiarity bias, we might decide to, Kat already mentioned this, we might decide to promote the person that we are more familiar with, that works for the business already, versus going to an external group of candidates to bring someone who is unfamiliar. So it happens all the time. And we want to be able to think about, and hopefully we can have a bit more of a conversation now around how do we manage the effect of some of these biases so that they don't have the potential negative impact that they could. So I'll hand back to Stuart and we can hopefully have a bit more of a discussion around this, some of the questions from the audience.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Hannah. And before that, thank you, Kat. What we'll do is we'll open up to questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box as we're going through there. Now, we've got some questions that have been sent in already, but we've also had the first one, a really interesting one to kick off with. Anonymous attendee on the Q&A box has put, how does behavioural biases impact organisational culture? Are there specific examples of scenarios which can be shared? Well, Kat and Hannah, think of a response to that. I'll give it my initial thoughts. I spoke about anchoring in number terms before, and how if you're talking big numbers, then that's where your mind is. We do that in terms of our behaviours all the time. The social norms around us, or if you're looking at what the markets do, the sort of herd behaviours are really, really strong because we're social animals. You can see this in examples whereby psychologists have staged crimes on the street and got actors primed beforehand, and in some scenarios lots of people step over someone who's being mugged or ignore it, and disproportionately, if everyone else is ignoring it, we are highly more biased to ignore it as well. And if people are rushing towards a situation saying fire or looking to intervene, then we are disproportionately more able to do that. Bringing it into the financial services area, one of the things that we've had across particularly banking, my industry over years, is the idea of poor behaviour towards customers, and one of the things that the professional institutions, professional bodies do is try and bring codes of conduct to address that. So if you think about the time back when there was lots of selling of PPI, and I'll declare, I was involved in selling PPI, hopefully on the better end. But if everybody around you is doing something and selling product and dealing with the product, or speaking about customers a certain way, or taking it outside of financial services, are acting on the pitch if their football is in a certain way and we're different, then that is the reference point that you've got. Now, you might find you're slightly better than the people around you. You can feel good, but you can easily be swept around by the culture. And maybe if you're in a famous building in the centre of London and everyone else is having parties and suitcase of wine, but you're not quite joining in as much, you're still being dragged along by the culture, but you're still feeling okay. Hannah, I know you deal with this directly in organisations.
Yeah, no, I agree with you totally, Stuart. I think social norming is a massive influence when it comes to this. I think organisational culture is affected by, well, a culture is determined by the people that are within that organisation and the kind of conversations they have and the kind of relationships that they have. I think from a recruitment perspective, it's interesting because what happens a lot of the time is, and I know there's been lots of work in recruitment practices within organisations to train interview panels around unconscious bias, because it's one of the things that happens very often is that we recruit people who are like us, because those people, they feel similar and we think we get them, they think in the same way as us, they might even look like us. There's lots of stuff that comes into this, and unfortunately then what happens is we have, certainly at senior levels within organisations, replicas of each of those people, but it can also happen cascading throughout the organisation. So really understanding those biases that we have from a recruitment perspective is really important, because that will massively affect the culture. What we want is a diverse culture where we have lots of different people from different backgrounds, from different roles in the past. We also want diversity in thinking style, which is something that we can assess through psychometrics. We can see, are these people similar to what we have within the organisation already, or do they actually think in a different way? Because that's one of the things that we often miss out. We go, well, they have diversity in all these different areas, but they actually don't think very differently to me or you. So therefore, well, are we all just going to agree with one another? And that will have a knock-on effect through organisational culture. One of the other elements as well, taking it away from recruitment, I've also seen is when people have individuals within their organisation who aren't performing very well. And I have to say, from experience, I've seen this a lot in the public sector. I've got examples from the private sector as well, but certainly in the public sector, their tenure is very high. And there's often this sense of almost a fear of performance management of, well, you can't get rid of anyone here, everyone stays. And so there is sometimes quite serious issues with underperformance in certain areas. And what happens is people just get moved around the organisation to different departments, or they get moved to a different public sector organisation on secondment. And people are fearful of dealing with these performance issues. And a lot of the time that can be for various different reasons. One of the things I see a lot is this concept that we call the sunk cost fallacy. So people feel as though they've been putting so much effort into trying to get this person to be better, that they almost just think, well, I've gone so far now, I've been spending this amount of money on this salary for this person for this long, what's the point? I'll just carry on. It's the same thing if you stood in a queue, you know, you're at Centre Parks with your kid and you're waiting to go in the swimming pool, and you've been stood in the queue for an hour and you think, oh God, do I really want to stand in this queue for another hour to get into the swimming pool? But you stand there because you've already sunk an hour of your time into standing in the queue. So actually that additional hour you're going to spend could be much better spent doing something more fun. But because this idea, this sunk cost fallacy of, well, I've already put a load into it, so I'm just going to carry on with something that actually doesn't really make any sense. And it happens in organizations as well. So I think those, going back to organizational culture, of course, people who are underperforming are going to affect that culture, because from my perspective, the person who is performing the worst within an organization sets the bar for everyone else. If you're, as a leader, as a business owner, saying, I accept that level of performance, then ultimately everyone goes, well, I could perform at that level. And it will affect the culture, especially in smaller businesses. So we have to be aware of this. And I think any time where you look at a decision and you think, why are you doing that? That seems so strange. It's usually because there's some kind of bias involved. And it really is just a case of holding up a mirror to someone going, let's look at this situation, try and look from a bird's eye view at the different things that are going on here and see how you've ended up in that situation, because there's a lot of these shortcuts that will have influenced that.
So if it doesn't look right, it possibly isn't.
Well, yeah, I think so.
I like
Not all
that.
the time, but a lot of the time, yeah.
Kat, did you want to come in on that as well?
Absolutely, and just wanted to say that definitely social norms and herding behavior are the sort of top driving factors in terms of the organizational culture. I think one additional factor that is definitely worth mentioning is are framing effects. This is particularly in the context of rewards towards people, employees working for a particular organization. I think in the current world where companies change their strategies, their tactics, their targets very frequently, and they operate in this environment that is full of kind of current influence, digitalization, uncertainty. It's really important for the key management, for leadership, to implement appropriate incentives, to communicate these changes appropriately, and to drive the sort of cultural change, starting from this really bottom-up approach. And in that context, framing effects can be extremely useful, because every decision, every change can be framed as something positive. And if it's perceived as something positive as opposed to something negative, whether it's cutting the number of jobs, whether it's cutting the number of holidays, whatever it is, if we can turn it around and explain what benefits it will have, particularly in terms of the long term, then people are much more willing to sort of stick to these initiatives, identify themselves with them, and that can really change the cultures of the entire companies. And I think we've seen quite a bit of this nudging that has been applied by some of the key companies.
A nudge there from Kat to take off on mute. Thank you. Sticking with the same theme, but maybe a bit looking at individuals, we've had a question which links to this, which is saying that one of the panelists mentioned that biases are part of our personalities. If we're going to ensure our decision making isn't hampered by biases, how do we go about it? Kat, do you want to carry on with that?
Absolutely. I mean, there are many different ways, and to be honest, recently there's been a lot of articles released by really prominent economists and psychologists regarding how we can reduce the impact of biases. I think the general conjecture is that we can never really fully eliminate the impact of biases as long as we are human beings, because there will be certain factors, like external factors like emotions and as I mentioned, personality traits that we can control better for, but we can never fully control. So they will be somehow always sort of out of our control and will be impacting us negatively. But there are other things that we can improve, such as giving more attention to a specific decision that we have at hand, trying to recall information that is relevant to it. In fact, searching for the information that is relevant in the first place, looking at people around us, whether they have faced similar situations, what sort of decision have they made in the specific context, this comparison, searching for the information, educating ourselves, particularly in the context of information that we're not familiar with. So while all of this can really help us improve our decision making, unfortunately, as human beings, yes, we will be exposed to biases. And for us, in terms of the personality, so in terms of the factors that are that we can influence less, we can still improve them by simply being aware of them. And every time we make a decision, questioning whether this is the right decision, and questioning what would have happened if we made a different decision. So there are different ways of de-biasing ourselves, and there is plenty of literature on this sort of strategy, so I'd be more than happy to talk about it more extensively, but I wonder whether Hannah would like to add.
Yeah, no, I think everything you've said there, absolutely agree with. And one of the things that I sometimes say to my coaches is go and ask the person who you think is going to disagree with you what they think. Because usually, that confirmation bias kicks in and we just go, like Kat said, we go and look for the information that almost supports what we already think. And so that can also then transpire to, if we're trying to analyze a decision before we finally decided what we're going to do, so we've started to try and manage some of these biases, what people will do is they'll just say, oh yeah, I did go and ask them what their opinion was. But it's also important who you ask, because if you ask someone who thinks the same as you, that's maybe got the same background or experience, etc., then they'll probably go, or maybe if there's someone that is generally agreeable because that's part of their personality and they are quite conflict avoidant and that's another element of their personality, they probably will just say, yeah, that's a great idea. So I always think it's interesting to go and ask the person who you think generally is probably going to say, hold on a minute, I wouldn't do that, whether you actually take on board what they say. But it's always interesting to get that almost devil's advocate perspective. Sometimes you can play devil's advocate on yourself and think, okay, well, what would happen? Or if I went the opposite way with this decision, what might the outcome be? Sometimes that's quite hard for people to do, to think hypothetically in that way. So it can be easier to go and ask someone else, but be conscious of who you're asking, I think, is important.
And I'll just add to that, one way that doesn't work, looking at it the opposite way, you would expect that sort of going on a diversity course, for example, to address more general biases might do the job. Now, there's evidence in the United States where people have been on a course, sometimes it actually makes the situation worse, because subconsciously people think, I've been on the course, I've ticked the box, and then don't actually take the time and make things a conscious decision in the way that Kat and Hannah have talked about there, and go on to make even more biased decisions because they're not thinking about things. So sometimes even some of these interventions, if they don't force you to think and analyze it, can make things worse and not better. We've got loads of questions coming in now. A nice one here about behavioural biases concerning investments in cryptocurrency, non-fungible tokens, and how do you think biases, the most prevalent ones, are? I don't know, Kat, do you want to come in on that? What's maybe driving some of that?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a very up-to-date question, and I'm afraid that the answer to that is rather outdated, in the sense that we will see the impact of the same biases that we've seen in the context of standard investment decision-making. Let's not forget, Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, maybe relatively new currencies new type of investments, but at the end of the day, they do require very similar type of decision making from the potential investors. So I think some of the most common biases that I would expect to see in the context of cryptocurrency would be herding behavior. And we've seen that really explicitly when Musk has released a piece of information after which immediately the price of Bitcoin has dropped significantly because just everybody followed what Elon Musk is doing. And of course, the overconfidence. So those who already dealt with Bitcoin will be even more overconfident in terms of kind of further transactions and decision making. So I think we have to go back to the original standard decision making and see how various portfolio managers, individual investors, but also kind of mutual fund managers are sort of dealing with the situation and to which biases they expose, because the answers will be very similar.
Hannah, over to you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's an interesting one when you think about, I suppose, I would look at that from a more of a personal investing perspective and seeing what friends and family and people that you work with, these kind of trend investments and things that are talked about more commonly in the media. So it all gets influences us to invest in certain ways. And yeah, I think, like Kat said, I think herd behavior bias probably is the strongest one that comes in there. It's the principle of what we see others do and we're influenced by that. There's lots of stuff, Cialdini's principles of influence talks about that element of we look to others to guide our behavior, and it happens all the time. So I think anything where whether it's in a personal context or in an organizational context, if we see people in our professional peer group doing something or investing in a certain way, we will also be much more likely to adopt those same behaviors.
Wonderful. And something that our regulator, the FCA, certainly in the banking space, are quite concerned about is people either following behaviors from inappropriate advice, or just following the fact that they're going in a bank and someone in a nice suit and shiny shoes, a nice young man, nice young woman, they must know what they're talking about, and then doesn't properly think about things. These can have an adverse impact. Wonderful. Loads of questions coming in. An interesting one, this may be one for you, Hannah. Is there any value in remaining in a company if you don't ascribe or agree with its cultural values and norms?
Interesting. I mean, I think I don't think I could give a yes or a no answer to that question, which probably isn't very helpful, but I think it's if you feel as though the culture doesn't fit with what you need and it's causing stress or it's causing any kind of negative impact on your mental health, for example, I think that absolutely it's something that you should consider leaving. I probably would do the same thing. I suppose one of the things, and it's hard to have a dialogue about it, but I suppose it would ultimately depend on how much you could influence that culture. If you're in a senior role, then I would hope that you have the impact to or the influence to be able to change that culture in some way. But if you're in a bigger organization, it's very hard to be able to do that. And so, yeah, I think that my answer probably to that would be, I would consider it, yes, but think about, ultimately what it is that you're looking for and what kind of culture do you want? Why don't you like the culture that you're in? And I would say from experience, working with larger organizations, 1,000 people plus, you often have microcultures within an organization like that. Some people refer to them as silos, and sometimes that can be have a negative connotation, but certainly you get these microcultures where a certain team or a division or a department has its own culture. So I think largely an organizational culture of a bigger organization is very determined by lots of different factors. It might be that you move from one department to another and you get an entirely different experience. So it might be that you don't have to leave the organization altogether. You could look, but I would certainly say, think about what it is that you don't like, what it is that you want. And I always say to people when they're looking to move, if I do career coaching, for example, with people, I'll spend time to really help them write a list of all the criteria. You know, what is it that you're looking for within an organization, and almost go out and look for those different elements within different companies, trying to research them a little bit more. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
A really tough question. I'm going to try and merge a couple. Oh, Kat, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just very briefly, I'd like to link to what Hannah said and kind of recall as well that earlier you talked about anchoring, and we need to understand that norms are also changeable. So what is a norm currently may not be a norm in the next 5 years. So I think we shouldn't from a scratch or from a start say, no, this is not something that is worth me pursuing, because we've seen from the companies, you know, moving from plastic to glass, from glass to plastic, and to all other different products and services, that we are adaptable. We learn constantly and we change our preferences. So preferences are also something that change over time. So I'd say that while initially we may not be necessarily pleased to identify ourselves with a particular company, we don't know how our taste, our preferences, our attitudes are going to develop, and how they're going to shift this reference point that from a loss may turn out to be actually a gain. Thanks.
Wonderful. Yeah, wonderful. So Anthony's asked a question which is quite a long one, but so I'm going to break it up. So he asks or states whether biases inherently are not morally wrong in themselves. Is it ethical to behave? And James Devlin mentions the nudge unit. Are nudges ethical if we use that? What's your view, Kat?
Well, I actually wrote a grant on that topic, so it's a brilliant question. And again, I will probably be quite disappointing in terms of the answer. There is no clear-cut answer. So there's been a lot of studies, again, conducted regarding what people personally think about nudges. And I think it always depends on the personal preference, views, but also on who you're going to ask. So many people view some type of nudges, like nudges towards better financial behavior or wiser consumer behavior as something that should be actually greatly promoted. We've seen, for instance, food labeling and informing us about about calories intake, which of course was aimed at people to consider before they're buying particularly unhealthy or sugary product. The same we observe with cigarettes, with alcohol. And I think most people socially would agree that these changes, this sort of nudges, are actually desirable. But I think the bigger question is, how far can we nudge? So how far can we go in order to actually make people consider a decision? Because at the end, we are here almost threatening people's ability to be free, to make these three choices. And I think this line between nudging and making independent three decisions is very thin and has been greatly debated. And I'm afraid there is still no clear-cut answer to that.
So I'm going to add a couple of thoughts, if I may. I think, and I'm going to borrow the idea from the book Nudge itself, where Thaler answered that actually sometimes if you're going to present a set of choices, there has to be a default one. Now, his was in the context of a restaurant, and they discovered that if the salad was easier to reach, that more people would have salad rather than the unhealthy options. Sometimes you have to present things in a way that you've got to present it in some order. It's kind of the idea. Now, what that might mean for financial services is you've got to have a fallback position that if a customer doesn't reply to, I don't know, pension options or something like that, that something's going to happen. And it might actually be that that somebody has to choose what's going to be the least worst option for the consumer in that space. But prior to that, you want to try and inform, educate, and get the consumer to make their decision themselves first, if that's a good idea. And if anyone wants to know more, if that's James Devlin from Nottingham, has got some really nice papers to sort of explain some of that, I think, as well. So a bit of a plug there. James actually come back. Is an argument to say that at the very least people should know they're being nudged. Interesting.
I think it's hard because we're being nudged really every day. You know, we watch telly, there are adverts that are trying to influence us to buy certain products. We, you know, people will send an email in a certain way that tries to nudge our thinking and our behavior. They're trying to influence us. And so it's really hard to say that, you know, we should know, because ultimately, I suppose, I mean, if you're a skeptic like me, I suppose you probably go into every situation thinking, what's the ulterior motive here? What's the agenda? But yeah, I think it's harder. I suppose I agree with you, Stuart, about the, you know, and I know we were talking about this before we came on the call today around the default rule. And there's lots of things that show, you know, ultimately if a better outcome can be achieved for society, and it feels like a win-win, then actually that's better. I mean, there are countries, I think this might have been in a reference from the nudge book, I can't remember where I read this, but you know, countries where they rather than allow people to opt into organ donation, they have opt-out mechanisms, and obviously their rates of organ donation for people is incredibly higher than countries where we have an opt-in mechanism like we do in the UK. So, you know, Stuart, you mentioned pensions, which we now have opt-out, and obviously that had to be done for a certain reason. So there are ways of doing it, I think, ethically, and ultimately for the greater good. Sometimes we just have to question, I suppose, who are the people that are making these decisions? Is it for the greater good, or is it for you know, their own good? And that's always hard to determine, isn't it, in a situation like this?
Oh, go for it, Kat.
Sorry, I'm just going to add, I think the fundamental problem with defining what the greater good is and how valuable nudging is that it's very difficult to quantify. Because if we do nudge someone, we can observe the results of nudging, such as it's been the introduction of the CARE Act in the US, or default rules, and increasing the savings of individuals, all observed in the US, UK, and in loads of other countries that really brought millions and billions of pounds of savings that could be spent in a better way. On the other side, we will never know what is the opportunity cost of that, because we will never be able to observe what would have happened with this amount of money if that hasn't been implemented. So I think we do need to make some judgments, and I think that's from a judgment book by Kahneman and Tversky, and they will always be to some extent subjective. But I think it's good to believe that they are done with this pursuit of greater good, and sometimes we just need to put a little bit more trust in others, making sure that they are indeed trying to do that with this kind of positive things in mind.
Wonderful. Moving a slightly different change of direction, but still on decision making. Vincent Fitzsimmons has asked, there are suggestions that traders should get in a flow state to trade at the best. Do you think this leads to better performance, or is it just letting your biases and heuristics take over? The idea of flow state is very much in that subconscious, completely absorbed in your work. I'm not going to try and pronounce the name of the guy who's come up with that. I'll let Kat do that maybe in a little while. Should people be completely absorbed and in that sort of space? So I'll give some thoughts maybe on that first of all. And that's a really nice intervention that Ray Dalio speaks about. I can't remember the name of his firm, but very famous fund manager in the United States. And they've adopted a hybrid approach with both human and sort of computer intervention. And what they do over there is the fund manager takes decisions, but if the decisions start to fall out of parameters, they get a nudge, a message saying, look, actually, this is starting to drift from what we would normally do here. Are you sure that's right? And the reason I quite like that approach is it forces you to take yourself of system one we talked about earlier into that conscious space and actually think, why am I making a decision? Maybe am I biased, going back to Hannah and Kat's earlier points, but it still leaves the person in control of that decision making. Now, I don't think that's perfect, but that's quite an interesting intervention. Hannah, any thoughts on the fund manager side and that sort of flow state?
I don't think that it's something that we probably have a perfect solution for. I think it's interesting what you've shared about that organisation in the States around how they've got around that. I suppose I would say from an organisational perspective is assessing the ultimate impact overall of those decisions. I think that what sometimes we can end up doing, and probably again that availability bias kicks in, is one decision is made terribly and then the whole organisation reacts and puts certain rules and blocks in place to prohibit decision making being done in certain ways. And it's certainly the case for organisations that are in the public eye. They make one wrong step, one wrong thing, you've seen it at BBC, all sorts of different organisations, and then they put these restrictive methods in place. So I think it's really important for each organisation to almost identify what works for us. What kind of organisation do we want where we're influencing decision making? I think you've mentioned there that organisation still left it with the individual ultimately, but there was some kind of stopper to say, hold on a minute, this is going away and out of the normal parameters in which we would make our financial decisions. So I suppose there's probably not a one size fits all solution. It's for each organisation to identify what works for us in the type of decisions that we're making as a business. Yeah, Kat, I suppose I can hand over to you. You probably have some more to say on that.
It's a great question. Everything that you said, Hannah and Stuart, is really fascinating. I just wanted to add that it's a good idea, and then we've seen increasingly the use of robo-advisors and AI in terms of this financial decision making and generally providing advice. But I think there is one warning that we should definitely be aware of, namely the fact that even these algorithms written for this, very complex systems, they still are often written by human beings or developed by them. And there is still a huge potential that they do inherit this human personality or some elements that also will make them biased to at least some extent. So I totally agree with Vincent, and I think it's a great idea to improve decision making that way by reducing this level of biasness. But I don't think this can be fully eliminated even with this complex solutions.
Kat's very cleverly picked up on Paul Raby's question there about biases in automated credit decision making. What about the normal process of maybe making financial decisions and deciding whether to lend somebody some money or make another financial decision? How do we think biases creep into that sort of situation?
Is a question for me, Stuart?
Can be, if you want.
I think you're an expert because you've actually been working in the industry, and I think you have huge kind of experience in terms of not saying personally that you've been biased when making particular decisions, but you observed people being biased and being influenced by everyday factors in making decisions, for instance, regarding providing lending and borrowings to different types of agents. So Paul, I can only say that there are probably dozens of different biases working at the same time. But the good thing is that while some biases will almost strengthen each other, there will be other biases working at the same time that will reduce the impact of the other biases working. So this is the beauty about biases. Sometimes they actually solve the problem themselves. I cannot tell you exactly what biases will be at work. I mean, there will be an extensive list, and I'm sure Stuart is going to talk about some biases related to how we perceive customers in a second, but there are absolutely plenty. And well, I'm happy to provide you a more extensive list afterwards, if that's okay.
So you can tell Kat and I have worked together before, because she knows exactly where I'm going to go with this. In terms of, I've done some work around priming, which is whereby maybe visual images that people see before can influence decision making. And what it indicated is absolutely it does. So how people look influences the way that experienced lenders, and in this case bankers, decided whether to give credit or not. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise, because experienced people are human, as Kat said before. They're going to be subject to biases. The interesting thing that I think is it's quite clear if somebody is one of the isms. So you've got sexism, racism, etc., and interventions can be designed to go, well, actually, I need to take a step back, and am I biased, and check. The more difficult area is maybe if somebody is applying for a loan and they own a plumbing company, but they don't look like a plumber. Does that affect you in some way in terms of your decision making, and is not a bias that's one of the isms that's really easy to trigger? Hannah, over probably to the last word from you.
Yeah, I think I mean, generally there's so many different directions we could go with this conversation, isn't there? I think we'd probably go on for about 3 more hours going through all of the different things. But I think for me, I suppose a last point to just summarize, I suppose we've spoken predominantly more about the impact of these biases, these shortcuts, and we've touched on some of the things we can do to overcome potential negative impact of them. And I think that would be my kind of parting point for everyone, is to really think about and try and notice some of these things in the way that you make decisions. Having a decision-making diary is a really interesting tool that I've used before, where you, especially on bigger impactful decisions, to think about and slow down and note, well, how did I make that decision? Who did I speak to? Did I just make it really quickly, or did I take my time over the decision? And that can also help you to learn more about your personality style and how that influences your particular decision-making style. So I think that's one of the things that I would suggest everyone can do after today, is start to notice those biases a little bit more, and think about how they are impacting everything we're doing day to day, but specifically from an organizational perspective, how are they affecting those decisions in work, regardless of what job we do?
Which is an absolutely perfect set of recommendations for us to end today, because the ICAW, the Chartered Banker and the MMU, who I need to thank for letting us do this today, are biased towards us vaguely keeping to time. So a big thank you to everyone who's contributed and come along. A special thank you to both Hannah and Kat, who've given up their time to speak today. For those of you that want to look back on any of this, or if you've got colleagues who've not been able to get it, we will publish the recording. The Chartered Banker will put that on their YouTube channel very soon. And if you enjoyed this, our next event is on the 16th of February. We'll have a great event then, where we're looking at introduction into fraud, and maybe some of the interventions that they can do to stop people being biased and falling victim to that. So hopefully you can join us on the 16th. Other than that, thank you very much, and we hope to see you soon. All right, thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.